ladies and gentlemen, to today's meeting of the Panhandle International Business Forum. My name is Morrison, and I'm the Group Services Director here at the Amarillo Public Library. And we do have a little bit of a light crowd today, so please don't be shy. You're welcome to move up closer if you'd like to. Okay, today's topic is going to be on cross-cultural ethics and international exchanges. The speakers are Dr. Jim Owens and Mr. E.T. Manning. And if you'll please note that Paul Scanlon and Merrill Lynch will be our next speaker in January. The purpose of the Panhandle International Business Forum is twofold. The first purpose is specific information as it relates to international business, which will be related by today's two speakers. The second purpose is networking. So we encourage you to make business contacts not only at this meeting, but at future meetings. Dr. Jim Owens will begin today's presentation. He is a professor of international finance at West Texas A&M University. He has got his doctorate from Harvard University with a doctorate in financial management. In the past, he's been a professor of international financial management, corporate finance at Eimon in Switzerland. He's also been associate professor of international financial management, corporate finance, and financial institution at the Iran Center for Management Studies. At this point, I would like to introduce Dr. Owens.
If you all don't object, I will forego the opportunity of the loudspeaker. I do this for a living, so most people tell me I have a big enough mouth. Probably don't need the thing anyway. An interesting topic, cross-cultural ethics, in a sense almost an oxymoron. As soon as you say cross-cultural and ethics, you have created a problem. So those of you who are looking for absolutes are going to be disappointed. I don't deal in absolutes when you go international. Let me start a little bit, because we have to kind of define what you mean by an ethical dilemma. Start with a bit of a classic analogy. And that is to assume that we agree to sit down and play a game of poker some evening. And when I sit down and play, I inform you in a lighthearted way, humorous that I am, that I cheat. If you continue to play, my assumption is you no longer have a legitimate complaint about my cheating. You are there because you either want to catch me, you are entertained by how I cheat, or you think you can out-cheat me. But I have solved my ethical dilemma. I informed you to begin with that I am prone to less than perfect honesty at this game. The reason I raise that analogy is that at that instant, you have two separate parties to a transaction, both defining right or ethical entirely differently. If I walk away from the table a winner, you will feel that I was an unethical cheater. I will correctly feel, no, I wasn't. I played by the rules I established when I sat down at this table. If you out-cheat me, I will feel ethically outraged. You didn't tell me that you were a cheater. I thought there was only one at this table. Had I known you were going to do that, I would have behaved differently. Perhaps cheated more effectively, or at least perhaps been sufficiently honest that I had some legitimate cause for moral outrage. The problem is when you define something as ethical or right, it is relative to the environment within which you function. Whether it be a different culture, a different religious background, a different legal system. Leaving aside issues of harm to human, and when we talk here about international exchange, I assume we're talking primarily in a business context. Leaving aside that, there are relatively few absolute ethical answers in the global environment, because we all come to the problem in different ways. I want to talk about this issue using a conceptual framework that I find fairly useful when I am working abroad, and that is what I refer to as NSR, N being the nature of the ethical dilemma, and we'll come back to it in a moment. S being from whence does it come? What is the source of the ethical dilemma? And finally, R being how would I propose to resolve this in a way that's acceptable to both parties. When you talk about a nature of an ethical conflict, and I'm going to again assume that they are trade-based, a whole host of opportunities come to mind. One is that you have signed a contract, as has the other party, and it subsequently, perhaps at the dismay of one or the other party, is altered. We alter the terms of payment. I agreed to be paid in a certain way or to pay in a certain way. After the transaction is partially completed, I decided it is appropriate to change those terms. What most of you, I suppose, expected when you looked at the nature of the topic for today, bribes and payoffs, back sheets, grease money, under the table, however you want to call it. As an aside, when I spent 4 years in Iran, that was the golden age of Iran, when the money was flowing through the streets. And being from the Harvard Business School, unfortunately, they have a very widely publicized alumni list. I was inundated with telephone calls from other Harvard alumni whom I had absolutely no knowledge of. I mean, these people just came out of the blue. We both went to the same school. Don't you want to introduce me to the Minister of Finance so that I can indulge in some sort of business activity? Shockingly enough to some people, but seemingly irrational from my perspective, I said certainly. As long as you post a certain sum of money. And immediately they go off in some sort of moral outrage. My God, you're dealing in payoffs. No, I'm not. One thing I'm doing is I'm filtering who wants to play this game. I have a finite amount of time, and I will find out who wants to put the money on the table and who is just simply blowing smoke and carrying a catalog. 2, the money went into escrow. It was used to pay back my Iranian friends for the damage that was done to them when these contracts, in fact, were not fulfilled later. So I felt that a little bit of upfront money was entirely appropriate. It didn't line my pockets, but it did solve a couple of other problems. But those are fairly common. People who attempt to avoid a normal review, a scanning or an audit, is another example of an ethical conflict. People dealing in inside information. We have a fairly narrow definition of what we consider public information and inside information in this economy, not always shared elsewhere. I'm assuming that we're not dealing here with a human problem, something that would cause physical harm. And so I am not proposing, because in that case I don't think you have much of an ethical conflict at all. If in fact you are being asked to perform some activity that legitimately could be considered to be potentially harmful to humans, I think you have a very easy answer to that. Is you need to back out of that situation very quickly. Number one, you are not going to be an effective player simply because it is against your own moral code, against your own ethical code. Number two, you run enormous risk, tremendous risk we'll talk about. But if you're in one of those situations where the contract's been altered, the terms are altered, upfront money, whatever the term, first thing you've got to do is define what's the nature of the problem you're having with this. Number one, and pretty obvious, and Mr. Manning I'm sure will address the issue as well, it's illegal. Either here or there. It is flat against the law to do this. And that is an interesting dilemma. You might get by with it, but it is illegal. Secondly, it abrogates or it rolls over some local cultural standard, whether it be your own or theirs. But what is being asked of you, the nature of the problem you have with it may be that in fact you are going against that culture. There is always the possibility that you are creating the blackmailer problem. And they are very common when you get involved in doing things in business that are not of our culture. That is, if you pay them once, the blackmailer problem is you will then get to pay them again. And again, and again, and again. Until at some point, it either becomes impossible to continue or you decide to come clean, which you probably should have to begin with. But that is a possibility. It may well create a situation where the nature of the problem you're facing is that if I do this, it taints all other future transactions. In effect, I've set a precedent. And how do I then become morally outraged in the next transaction? They can always go back and say, but it happened here. We know that that's what you are, what your nature is. Why isn't it happening now? I view more critically the second stage, and that is, where does this ethical conflict come from? What is its source? There are a whole group of sources, one of which is what I call the trader mentality. In the United States, many of the people I do business with, as well most of North America, including some Canadian clients I have, we have been industrialized for a rather extended period of time. We have operated, and unfortunately continue to do so, in a closed-loop system. I really, in fact, could run a very comfortable business in North America. I don't need to go global. As a consequence, we have a perception that time is very long, and deals that you do, trade relationships you have, come back to haunt you. That is, you need to be a good corporate citizen because you're going to be in this same little cocoon for a long time. And other people will hear if you're not one. So the consequence, we tend to look at our transactions in a way that says, I'll do this even though it's not the most profitable thing I can do in the short run, because long term it will pay. We find it very uncomfortable when we work in an environment that is occupied by what I call the trader mentality. A transaction is a one-time event. It is a transaction with a stranger, and my objective as that party is to get the greatest possible gain, because you're not coming back. Now, lest you think that is limited internationally, you need to take a long trip on your car sometime, you will come across the trader mentality. Blow a water pump in outback New Mexico on I-40, and you will become intimately familiar with the trader mentality. If he has a water pump, it's the only one within a 300 square mile radius. You will promptly pay whatever is asked. Cheerfully. That's the trader mentality. In a large number of business areas, that is the way business has been done for years, because they don't have that strong cocoon economy that says whoever you do business with is coming back. The people they've always done business with are passing through. And the game is to maximize every single transaction, because you may never do business with them again. You can't recoup anything you don't get now. And both parties understand that. And they negotiate accordingly. It's different. Similarly, there may be what I call reviewer anomalies, and that's a long-winded way of saying, in the United States, and to some extent in Europe, and to some extent now in the Far East, it has diminished some of their aggressive competitiveness, I suppose. We have a culture that is very sensitive to what other people think of us. People who I don't even know. There is, I suppose, an assumption that I would like it printed on my tombstone as an epitaph, that he was a swell fellow, honest and forbearing in all of his dealing. That is not always the case. In many arenas, you are responsible not to a global society. You are responsible to a tribe, to a family, to a very small group whose basic concern is, how well did we do? You find it in that particular situation very uncomfortable to go back and say, well, we could have gotten them for a little more, but I wanted to be thought of well. The tribe is saying, whoa, that's us who gave that up. Your obligation is to maximize what you can get out of the transaction. You owe that to us. The global society comes later. That's not now. Now is the transaction we're in. There is a different accountability issue. I do a lot of work with European firms. I'll give you one good example. One of them is a Swiss firm that prior to the breakup of the Soviet Union had spent a lot of time and money putting some engineers, some electrical engineers, power transmission engineers into one of the East Bloc countries. Didn't make a dime. Knew they wouldn't make a dime. couldn't sell anything. People they were dealing with couldn't afford anything. They bankrolled those power transmission engineers for about 5 years. Free grads. Those people, since they were there and very well educated, very bright, spent a lot of time designing the power transmission system for that country. When, in fact, the breakup came and they decided to modernize, not unsurprisingly, the specs on that design can only be satisfied with that company's product. Is that unethical? Swiss would argue it's not. We spent 5 years of two extremely talented people with no known expectation we'd ever be paid back. And in effect, we didn't look every year to say, well, what was your income this year? How well did that profit center do? What those people did, they came back and said, well, how's things going? Meeting some folks, great designs. Did you buy it? No, they're not going to buy anything, but they like us a lot. And the design is really elegant. When they finally came to buy, they bought from that company because of that obligation, in a sense, almost necessity to comply with that design. Now, in time, of course, that advantage will diminish because other participants will be able to come in. But those people look at that investment of human energy in a different time frame. And I'm not sure it creates an ethical problem. It's just how you define it. Similarly, there is a school of thought. This will date me a good bit. Most people don't study it anymore. There's a school of economic theory called Veblennian economics. Done by Thorsten Veblen. And very few people have ever read Thorsten Veblen, which is unfortunate because I think he was one of the great economists of the 1800s. But Mr. Veblen posited an economic theory that is germane to what we're talking about. His posit was that luxuries, ethics, art, only come from conditions of surplus. When you are working at a subsistence level, many of these niceties are not of great concern. Survival is an incredible instinct. And his theorem was that cultures develop these kinds of luxuries only when they have enough capacity that they can afford them. When you go global, many of the cultures, particularly in the developing arena of the world, are still very close to subsistence level. They don't see the problem the same way you do. They can't afford to. Now, someday they hope to, but at this point, survival is a tremendous instinct. And it may not just be one of sheer physical survival. A common problem, one example I'll use in a moment or two, that we run into when you deal in import-export has to do with clearing customs. And customs agents with their hands out. Well, you can view that as crooked people looking for a handout, a bribe. Or you can try to put yourself in the position of being a civil servant in an overly bureaucratic environment who barely makes a living wage, who is now moonlighting. In many respects, probably with the approval implied of the government for whom he works. Why? Because they can't afford to pay them anymore. And this is a way to get a raise. And in effect, what you've done is you have imported capital. Now, if you are very close to subsistence, that's perfectly rational. When you have surplus, you say, well, that's not right. We shouldn't do that. But I'm not sure that's true. If I were hungry and I had my family that was hungry, you'd be amazed how quick my hand might pop out. If I thought my position could, in fact, get me, quote, a raise. Now, again, before people get too morally outraged, how many of you have not given yourself a raise doing that? Ever been disappointed with what they offered this year? Taking a few extra minutes off, have you? Made a few extra copies of the old corporate Xerox? manage to be gone on a Friday? That's a raise. They're no different. It is identical. That's just the way people reward themselves when they are put in a position of feeling powerless. They can't improve themselves through any other mechanism. They'll get a raise somehow. And I'm not sure we're immune to that. The form is different, but the net effect is almost identical. Really is very little different. There is also the possibility that what is being attempted is to alter negotiation position. That is what I think is by far one of the most common causes of these cross-cultural ethics dilemmas. That is, one party or the other, particularly oftentimes it is the party in the country with whom you are doing business. The concern is, on their part, that they were negotiating from a position of weakness. Now that your goods have been shipped over to this country, the negotiation position was just altered. Your goods are sitting in a container at the port. You need them to clear it. All of a sudden, they can now negotiate in a much stronger position than they could when they were desperate to just get the goods on the boat. And in many respects, those contracts are simply a way of moving where the negotiation power base lies. If you understand that going in, it's not a problem. If you build a little slack into the system to deal with it. But to expect them to continue to be the weak participant in the negotiation process, in the payment process, when in fact, by virtue of your shipping the goods to their country, the position of change is going against your nature. Saying you have a strength, don't use it. Again, we're back to the Lenin economics now. That is, you can afford not to use it. They have it and they will use it. There is also always the possibility, among others, that you're dealing with somebody who feels like the rules don't apply to them. They're above the law. Always happens. There are people in every environment. You need to deal with them the same way you do with most of them. Don't do business with them. It will come back to haunt you. That one is fairly straightforward. The resolution of all this, I would recommend that if you look to the source before you look at the details of the kind of ethical dilemma that's being posed, to where you understand why they're doing it, you might find the solution. Rather than becoming outraged or angry, and I'm sure Mr. Manning will agree with as well, for heaven's sakes, negotiate before you ever start to litigate. Remember, you're suing them in their world. Right? I will assure you that getting a judgment against them in Amarillo, Texas is not one of the more frightening thoughts in their mind. You can waive it, but it doesn't mean much when you're 4,000 miles away from here. And getting one in their world is going to be a little tough. You need to negotiate first. But the point is, if you understand what they want, maybe there's another way to supply them with that without damaging yourself. For example, very recently, we ran into a problem with one of the people I work with where there was a contract signed for some goods. They had been shipped. They were to be paid upon delivery to the customer's door, which was a foolish contract to begin with. There was no prepayment in it. They were to be paid only upon delivery, clearance of customs, in good form, unpacked in the boxes, then we will pay you. They got stuck in customs, couldn't get them out. Meanwhile, the bills are mounting up because we're out the money on this end to build the product. We've got the carrying cost, it's eating us alive. We need to get out of this deal. The customer is saying, look, my hands are tied, I can't do anything. The nature of it was that apparently the customs officer wanted a bribe. The source of it could come from two different places when you think it through. One is they simply wanted an income enhancement. We're back to survival mode. The other is that the buyer wanted different people. Because they lived there. If there was a way to get it through customs, presumably they should have known about it. If they needed the goods that bad, they should have been able to help. Instead, they were sort of, well, you know, our deal was delivery at my door. There were a variety of resolution potentials in front of us. One is we could have retreated, just put stuff back on the boat and shipped it back. And then the problem is what do you do with it when you get it back here? Eventually, probably could have parceled it out and sold it. We would have lost money on the deal. We could have renegotiated with the buyer. But I think that was one of the motivations that was in there. That is, you clear the goods and I'll pay you for your services. You could pay off the officer. Go back under the table again. Obviously, in hindsight, we could have gotten partial payment in advance, but we were kind of stuck at this point. We came up with a different answer. We made a few inquiries and got a few introductions to the minister. And we donated to them 2 of these handheld forklift trucks. Because obviously Customs was having a hard time moving the goods, or ours wouldn't have gotten stuck so long. And we donated them in a very public way as a goodwill gesture to encourage economic interchange between our countries and its citizens. At that point, you've got so much face out front on the part of the minister that the goods cleared. In fact, the next 3 orders have cleared with no problem at all. Did we give a bribe? I don't know. I don't think it was. We didn't pay an individual. We certainly did make our lives a lot easier. The minister now thinks, well, obviously these are very, not only nice fellows, they're also reasonably clever, because he obviously understood the game that was being played. Meanwhile, they got 2 of these little goofy hand forklift things, and they presumably can't drag things around with some greater speed now. But the point was, if you just went at it that you want a bribe, I'm outraged, let's fight, the stuff would still be sitting in the container at the port. We wouldn't have cleared the check. Our game was to get that stuff cleared, get paid, and get out of there. In a way that let us go back and continue to do business. And we thought this was a way that nobody's feelings were hurt. Nobody was called a thief, but somehow the goods got broken free. You do that by looking at the source, not at looking at the bribe. You got to think, what is it they want? Where are they coming from? Let me give you one other example before letting T spend some time with you. This one's personal. I about got stung. I did some consulting, and consulting work is deadly international. Not all that exciting domestic. You can see my accounts receivable list is pretty frightening. And most of them are U.S. But I had a personal consulting contract to do some feasibility work on a massive capital investment that a company wanted, making some new equipment. We agreed upon the terms. We agreed they'd cover my expenses plus my fees, and they would make payments periodically. Payments weren't making it. I completed the analysis phase, and they had it. They did not have the recommendations. That I was holding back. And there was still no money. Basically, they then came to me with an offer that they certainly understood their obligation and meant to fulfill it under slightly different terms, which is about half of what we agreed to. At that point, I got an interesting problem. I'd like to get my money because I'm out a fair amount. It was international, so I spent a fair amount on travel. The source of the problem is that they perceive that the negotiation power has shifted back to their court. Intellectual property is very hard to withdraw. I can't take my ball and go home. It's intellectual property. It's just my time. I fortunately had been, I don't know, whether clever enough or dumb lucky enough to have created, for tax reasons, a legal corporate entity in that country, whether it be a corporation or a private corporation. I needed it in order to get a tax ID number, in order to get paid through it, blah, blah, blah. What I did was I took that corporation to the bank, their bank, and I tried to borrow money against that contract. Because I needed the funds. And I assured the bank that I would be delighted to repay them out of the proceeds of this contract with this customer who they knew to be honorable, well-intentioned people. Of course, the bank had to agree with that. I still had the final report, still had the resolution, the recommendations on the project. The bank kept wanting the recommendations. The company wanted them because the bank needed to have the presentation made. I was extremely busy then because I had to make enough money from other activities to pay back that bank loan I had to borrow to cover the expenses I was out. The bank became aware that that was the holdup. Apparently, something was said somewhere because as if by magic one day, I was paid in full, including enough to cover the time I had to put into the final resolution or the recommendation phase of this whole project. The point is, if I sued them or I got angry, I don't have anything I can pick up and go home with. I can't put my stuff back in a box and leave. It's up here, and I've already given away most of it. What I needed was some way to put some pressure on those people to put the negotiation position back in my court. And I did that through using their bank. It's a better solution than coming right down their throat. Because again, you are doing business in their arena. It is by their rules. Not to mean in any way that those rules are wrong. If I lived there full time, I'd be awfully tempted to live by their rules too. That is the environment within which they function. But cross-cultural ethical dilemmas, I think, are to some extent blown out of proportion. In the sense that once you abandon the feeling that my way is the only way, you can come up with an answer. There's a way to work your way through it. If the first thing you do is a dignified retreat, go find a quiet place, calm down before you start shouting at people, and think your way through this. What is causing this situation to arise? Are they just simply crooked? Is it a situation where they're barely at survival mode? Are they trying to change the negotiation position? What is causing it? Then try to look for some creative solution, non-confrontative, where you can come up with an answer that makes both parties walk away feeling like they've won. Because as long as you play in their court, all the anger will do is make them right. You can't be right by being right. It's their game. And one of the things that is hard for people to deal with when you work global is the extent to which that is true. That you cannot necessarily impose our standards. Certainly, over time, as we become more globalized, I think you will see a set of global business ethics. Whether or not they model the U.S. is open to question. Open to a lot of questions. But I think you will see. We've got it in finance now. I do most of my work in international finance with the large multinational banks. I will assure you, most people fulfill their contracts. Easily. If they don't, you just spread the word. They're out of business. All you got to do is welch one time on a letter of credit, and that's the end of that game. I hope you made a lot of money, but you're not playing again. There's not that many players who play seriously that we can't control it. In effect, we have agreed upon, internationally in finance, we've agreed on a set of ethics by which we all play. If you do foreign exchange command by phone, you do it. You promptly tell yourself, don't ever, ever forget that first digit again. But if you just bought 1 million of them at the wrong price, you just smile and buy it. Because if you welch on it, your phone will never ring again. You can't do business. You can't get back into the game. So as a consequence, and the reason I raised that point is global finance, when we talk about a global economy, the movement of money, because it is nothing but electronics to us, it's just blips on the screen, is one of the first truly global commodities that we have on Earth. Money is money no matter where it is. Trade it anywhere. It's just blips. That's all that it is. As a consequence, we have, over the last decade and a half, we have worked out a set of acceptable financial ethics that work reasonably well. To take it to the next level of physical trades, commodities, products, it's going to be slower because you don't have the small set of large players who in effect provide their own market enforcement mechanism. But in finance, we have never relied on government. Government is an annoyance. They're there and you what you need to do to keep them off your back. I will assure you we can control the market much better in the market than the government will ever dream of doing, because we've got the money. At some point, the power to spend is the power to rule. They will be back, and they will either play right or don't play at all. The problem is that because it is such a universal commodity, was easily done relative to trying to do physical or personal contracts. Those aren't going to be much more difficult. But I do think this NSR thing has been useful as a way of thinking about it. My emphasis to you would be, if you're looking for resolution, think source of the problem, not the nature of it. Because most of the time, if you're working on a hidden agenda, it's not what it looks like it is. There's another layer under that, and you don't discover it until you kind of walk away and think about it and scratch your head. That's what they want. Okay, how do I get that to them without violating my own ethics, without violating my own sense of fair play or creating some of those problems?
I have a question for you, Dr. Owens. I've traveled around quite a bit in the oil business. Do you feel that the reply to all of this, and I've heard this from some people, is that you taught us how to be unethical. Now that we play the game, so well,
You're upset?
now you want it back again, and you don't want us to play anymore. How much do you think we're responsible, and countries like Germany and Switzerland, for that matter?
I think most of the industrialized world has taken advantage of this negotiation position. We have the products and we've got them. It's very hard to put back on the other place. And now they are competing with us for other products. It is, in many respects, it's a confluence of historical events. A lot of people in the U.S., and it goes depends on my class, have heard me raise this point. The golden quarter century, which will never be back, I hope, because I don't want to ever go through what it took to create it, was effectively from the mid-1940s to 1970. Why? Because we had the only functioning economy on the face of the earth. The others had all been bombed into oblivion. When you are the only person selling a product, you get to say what you pay for raw materials, you get to say what you sell the product for. If the customer on either side doesn't like it, I'll go ahead and try to eat that chromium for a while. Stuff is pretty cheap. And we took advantage of that, as any human would. That was a remarkable time in history. It really was. And no human, assuming that they have any self-interest motivation at all, could live through that and not take advantage of it. From the early 1970s, at the end of that quarter century on, the shoe is beginning to roll on the other foot. And it has been a very painful experience for people to deal with. Why can't it be like it was? Because we haven't had a world war lately that devastated everybody but us. And I hope we don't get one, because the toys they play with now tend to leave scorched earth, and it's going to be pretty difficult for anybody to come back in one piece. But that was that history, and unfortunately, a lot of the companies, as we became more global in the 1970s, and to some extent, I am a school of demographics. If you were a young person going through your training in that period, somewhere in that space, you came to power in the corporation in the 70s and 80s. Your whole experience set was that one. Now, you can read in Fortune, Forbes, Business Week till you turn blue about the new nature of the global economy, but your whole education and experience set lived in a time when you set price on both sides. So to expect a lot of our business people to flip overnight, I think is unrealistic. You're asking a human to do something they can't do. They're adjusting. Some of the new firms that are coming along, some of the older firms that have restructured, have become remarkably more adept at doing global business. But if you look at their management set, they've either trained themselves away from that experience or as new managers. And I'm not sure that I would fault some of those people for their attitudes. My gosh, they grew up in it. That's when they were the salesman, the assistant sales manager, then the manager, then the... Finally, they get to be the CEO. You you've got a quarter century of history, most of which was in a magical time for business. So to expect those people to suddenly pick up forks and say, oh, I understand, there's the light, now I'm local, is not realistic. It just isn't. So yeah, I think in many respects, there are people getting even. We'll outlive that phase too, because again, we've got almost 25 years now. By the mid-90s, by 2000, we should have that one pretty well behind us. At that point, I hope everybody's back on a level field. We can all forget that experience. But it was a unique time. As I say, I hope it doesn't come back because I don't like what we're using. It would be nice if we could have it in some other form. Other questions? Need to run these.